The evening air in Vadnagar was calm, but inside a small tea shop near the railway station, a young boy's heart was racing. Narendra, barely 12 years old, was wiping down the wooden counter while keeping one ear open to his father's quiet voice. Damodardas Mulchand Modi, with his gentle eyes and simple white kurta, was speaking to a tired-looking man who had just stepped off a train. The man had only one slipper, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He was clearly embarrassed, almost ready to turn away, but Damodardas stopped him with a warm smile. "Sit," he said softly, "and have a cup of tea. You do not have to pay." Narendra watched as his father poured the steaming liquid into a chipped cup, sliding it forward as if it were a priceless gift. Narendra didn't understand then why his father would serve a stranger for free. Later, when the man left, Damodardas noticed the question in his son's eyes. "When you have more than someone else," he said, "even if it is just one extra cup of tea, you must share. You never know when a small kindness will change a person's day or their life." Those words sank deep into Narendra's young mind. He did not know it yet, but they would shape the way he saw the world. They would guide him in moments of power and in moments of loneliness. They would also connect him, years later, to someone he had never met, a boy on the other side of the world, who would grow up to lead one of the biggest companies on earth. Decades passed, and Narendra's path took him far from the tea shop. Life tested him, sometimes harshly, but his father's voice stayed inside him like a steady flame. He learned to work hard, to rise again when he fell, and to never forget the faces of people who had less than him on the other side of the world. In a modest home in Chennai, a young Sundar Pichai was living his own quiet story. His father, an electrical engineer, would sit with him at the small kitchen table late into the night, explaining not just circuits and wires, but life. He told Sundar that greatness had nothing to do with where you were born, but with how you treated people when no one was watching. Both boys, one in Vadnagar, one in Chennai, were learning lessons they didn't yet realize would tie them together one day. They had never heard each other's names, but life was weaving their stories like invisible threads, waiting for the moment they would cross. One monsoon afternoon, many years later, Narendra, now the Prime Minister, was preparing for a meeting with the CEO of Google. It was supposed to be about technology, data, and digital growth. But as Sundar Pichai walked into the room, something unexpected happened. Narendra looked into his eyes, and in that instant, saw the same quiet respect his father had once shown. A stranger at a railway station, and Sundar, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt the same warmth he had felt as a boy listening to his own father's words. Neither of them knew it yet, but what was meant to be a formal meeting was about to become a personal journey, one that would reveal just how powerful a father's wisdom could be, even across decades and continents. The conference room was large, its walls lined with maps and screens glowing softly. Aides and officials moved quickly, placing files on the polished table. Narendra stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, as the rain outside blurred the view of the city. He had been in countless meetings like this, formal, structured, all about numbers and strategies. But as Sundar Pichai entered, carrying only a slim folder and a respectful smile, Narendra felt a strange pull in his chest. They shook hands firmly. Narendra noticed Sundar's eyes calm, steady, but holding something familiar. It was not just confidence. It was humility wrapped around strength, the same way his father had carried himself decades ago. Sundar, in turn, felt a quiet respect in Narendra's gaze, a sense that this leader saw more than just his title. The first minutes were filled with polite exchanges about technology, internet access, and future plans for digital India. Assistants typed notes. Cameras clicked in the background. But soon, when the others stepped out to prepare more documents, a rare silence filled the room. It was in that silence that the conversation changed. Narendra asked softly, "Tell me, Sundar, who taught you how to lead?" Sundar paused, surprised. Most people wanted to know about Google's projects or his business strategies, not his life. He set down his folder and spoke slowly. "My father. He did not have much money, but he had a way of making everyone feel seen. He told me that if you cannot respect the people who serve tea, you do not deserve to sit at any table, no matter how big." Narendra's heart skipped. The words felt like an echo from his own childhood. His father, too, had measured people not by their wealth, but by how they treated the most ordinary workers. For a moment, both men sat in quiet thought, each remembering a simple home, a modest father, and lessons that had shaped their paths. Narendra leaned forward. "My father also served tea," he said, his voice low but firm. "He taught me that a small act of kindness can be greater than any position you hold. Sometimes, it is not the power in your hand, but the warmth in your hand, that people remember." Sundar smiled gently. "Perhaps, sir, that is why we are sitting here today. Not just because of technology or politics, but because two fathers, in two different cities, taught their sons the same thing." They both knew the meeting would still cover the plans for connecting millions of Indians to the internet. But now, it carried something deeper, an unspoken connection between two sons who had never met before this day, yet had been guided, all their lives, by the same invisible compass. As the aides returned and the official agenda resumed, the tone in the room was subtly different. Each question, each proposal, carried a sense of mutual respect. It was no longer a negotiation between a government and a company. It was a conversation between two men who understood where the other came from. What neither of them knew was that this connection would soon lead to an unexpected gesture, one that would reach far beyond this room, touching people across India and beyond. The rain had eased outside, leaving the streets glistening under a soft, gray sky. Inside the conference room, the meeting was moving forward smoothly. Graphs were shown, timelines discussed, and agreements outlined. But in Narendra's mind, something else was forming, an idea that was not in the official papers. He kept thinking about Sundar's words, about his father's wisdom, about how two boys from simple homes had walked such different paths, yet carried the same values. He thought about how millions of young people in India, sitting in small villages and crowded towns, had dreams just as big. Many of them had talent, ideas, and determination, but no one to guide them. During a short break, Narendra stepped aside and spoke quietly to one of his aides. "Prepare a proposal for a youth mentorship initiative," he said, "but make it different. This one will have When the meeting resumed, Narendra leaned forward and looked at Sundar with a slight smile. "Sundar, we have spoken about technology, but what about people? What about the young mind in a small village who can dream as big as you, but has no path?" Sundar's eyes lit up. "I have thought about that often," he admitted. "When I was a boy in Chennai, I didn't even own a computer until I was much older. I used to wait for hours to read newspapers about technology. But once someone gives you a chance, it changes everything." Narendra nodded. "Then let us give them that chance together." There was a pause in the room. Aides looked at each other, unsure where this was going. Narendra continued, "I propose we create a program where leaders like you, Sundar, connect directly with students across India, not just through speeches, but through personal conversations, guidance, and sharing your real stories. No cameras, no ceremonies, just truth and hope." Sundar sat back, thinking. This was not in his schedule. It would take time, energy, and commitment. But then he remembered his father's words, the late nights at the kitchen table, the belief that respect and kindness could change lives. He looked at Narendra and said quietly, "Yes, I will do it." The aides began scribbling notes. The program would be designed to reach even the most remote schools. Video sessions would be set up, questions from students would be answered, and More importantly, each session would be about sharing failures as well as successes. But what no one knew was that Narendra had a personal reason for wanting this. Deep inside, he could still see himself as that boy at the tea stall, looking at travelers and wondering about the world beyond. He wanted to reach every boy and girl who felt that same distance and tell them they could cross it. As the rain clouds began to break, a small ray of sunlight streamed through the window. The meeting had started as a discussion about infrastructure and investment, but now it had become something more, a bridge between past and future, between two lives shaped by humility, and between countless young people and the dreams they might soon dare to chase. And while the plan sounded promising, the true test would come when it left the safety of paper and entered the real world, where doubt, criticism, and unexpected challenges were waiting. The announcement of the new youth mentorship program spread quickly. News channels spoke about it, newspapers printed bold headlines, and social media was filled with excitement. In small towns and villages, teachers read the news aloud to their students, and many children smiled for the first time in days. They imagined seeing Sundar Pichai on a screen, speaking directly to them, answering their questions. For them, it felt like a window to a world they had only heard about. But while the public excitement grew, not everyone was pleased. Inside certain offices, some officials whispered doubts. They said the program would be too expensive, too complicated, and would distract from more important government work. Others feared it would fail and become an embarrassment. Even within Sundar's team at Google, a few executives quietly questioned whether the CEO should spend time on something that didn't directly grow the company's profits. Narendra heard these whispers. Sundar heard them too. Both men had been in positions where criticism was part of the job, but this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just about policies or products. It was about their father's teachings, about giving something back. A few days before the first scheduled session, Narendra received a report from his team. It listed all the challenges: poor internet in rural schools, lack of proper screens in some areas, and concerns about whether students would even understand the English language. He sat quietly for a moment, reading the report. Then he remembered a rainy day in Vadnagar, when his father had handed tea to a man who had nothing. There had been no perfect conditions, no guarantee of success, only the decision to help anyway. That same evening, Sundar was in his office in California, looking over technical details for the program. One of his senior managers suggested postponing until all the infrastructure was perfect. Sundar listened, then shook his head. If we wait for everything to be perfect, we will never begin. My father started teaching me with a notebook and a pencil. We will start with whatever we have. When the day of the first session arrived, the atmosphere in the control room was tense. There were reports of rainstorms in some regions, and in others, power cuts. Yet screens in hundreds of schools began to flicker on. Students sat crowded in classrooms, some on benches, some on the floor, their eyes fixed on the screen. And then it happened. Sundar's face appeared, smiling gently, speaking not in complex technical terms, but in slow, clear words that any child could understand. When I was your age, he began, I had dreams that felt too big for my world. But dreams are not meant to fit inside your world. They are meant to take you beyond it. In another city, Narendra sat watching the session live, his hands folded on the desk. He could see the faces of the children, their eyes wide, their smiles growing, and deep inside, he felt something he had not felt in a long time, the quiet joy of seeing a seed of kindness take root. But just as things seemed to be going well, a sudden technical failure hit. Screens in several regions went dark. The connection to half the schools was lost. And somewhere in that moment, the entire program's success hung in the balance. The control room erupted in nervous chatter. Engineers spoke quickly into headsets, switching between screens filled with flashing red signals. The video feed had gone dark in half the schools, and the session had just begun. In classrooms across India, children's smiles faded as their screens turned black. In one village, a teacher tapped the side of the television, as if the problem could be fixed with a gentle knock. In another, students leaned forward, refusing to move, hoping the image of Sundar would return any second. Narendra's aide stepped forward, speaking urgently. "Sir, we may need to reschedule for the affected schools." Narendra shook his head. Slowly. "No, we are not stopping. Not after they waited for this day." His voice carried the same calm determination he had learned from his father, the tone that meant the decision was final. Thousands of miles away in California, the team was in motion. Technicians traced the issue to a network failure caused by sudden weather changes in 2 regions. The quick solution was to cut those areas from the live feed to save the rest of the program, but Sundar refused. "We don't leave anyone behind," he said firmly. "Find another way." For the next 20 minutes, the air was filled with tension. Backup servers were activated, alternate satellite channels were tested, and calls were made to local service providers. Narendra stayed in the control room, watching updates on the screen, his mind flashing back to the tea shop in Vadnagar. He remembered days when trains were delayed by hours, yet his father never told travelers to go home empty-handed. He always found a way to serve them. Finally, one by one, the disconnected screens began to flicker back to life. Cheers broke out in classrooms. Children clapped their hands, and teachers smiled in relief. Sundar's face reappeared on the screens, his voice calm and reassuring. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly into the camera, "life will test your patience. But if you keep trying, you'll find a way through." The rest of the session went on without interruption. Sundar answered questions from children about technology, dreams, and how to overcome failure. He told them stories of his own mistakes, of doors that closed in his face before others opened. Narendra watched closely, seeing how the children leaned in, hanging on every word. When the final school signed off, the control room filled with applause. But for Narendra and Sundar, the applause wasn't for themselves, it was for the quiet victory of keeping a promise. They knew that what had happened today would be remembered, not just because the program worked, but because they refused to give up on those who were left behind. As the screens went dark and the room began to empty, Narendra turned to Sundar, who was still on the video call. "This is only the beginning," Narendra said. Sundar nodded, a small smile on his face. "Yes. Now we make it bigger." Neither of them realized that this beginning would soon draw the attention of someone from Sundar's own past, someone who would bring a personal story that connected even deeper to Damodardas Mulchand Modi's words. A week after the first mentorship session, Narendra's office received a message from Sundar's team. It was unusual, not about technology or program updates, but about a person who wished to meet both of them. The message came from an elderly man living in Chennai, who claimed he had once worked alongside Sundar's father many years ago. His note was simple: "I have a story you should hear, and I believe it will explain why this program means more than you think." The meeting was arranged quietly, without media or cameras. A small conference room was chosen, with only a few chairs and a pot of tea on the table. Narendra arrived first, followed by Sundar, who had flown in from California. A few minutes later, the elderly man entered, walking slowly with the help of a wooden cane. His eyes, though tired, held a sharp clarity. After greetings were exchanged, he began to speak. "Many years ago, I was a junior technician in a small workshop in Chennai. Sundar's father was my senior. One day, a worker from a nearby railway station came in, asking for help to fix a broken light. I told him we were busy and could not leave, but Sundar's father stopped me. He took his own lunch break, walked with the man to the station, and repaired the light himself." He paused, looking at Sundar. "When I asked him why he would spend his only break helping someone for free, he said, My father once told me, never measure your worth by what you earn in a day. Measure it by the help you give in a day. Narendra leaned back slowly, his heart stirring. Those words, they were almost the same as the ones Damodardas Mulchand Modi had told him decades ago in Vadnagar. The old man continued, I do not know your father's full story, Sundar, but I know this. That day, he showed me a kind of leadership that does not need titles. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Narendra spoke softly, telling the man about his own father, the tea stall, and the lesson of the extra cup of tea. As the stories intertwined, it became clear to men, in two different cities, had carried the same wisdom forward, passing it to their sons, without ever meeting each other. Sundar's voice was quiet but firm. Our fathers never met, but their words found each other through us. Narendra nodded. And now, through this program, they will reach thousands more. The old man smiled faintly. Then it is true, kindness can travel farther than we imagine. When the meeting ended, there were no speeches, no photographs. Just three men walking out into the afternoon light, each carrying the weight and warmth of the same truth. That evening, Narendra stood by a window, looking out at the city lights. He thought of his father, of the tea stall, of a stranger with one slipper. Sundar sat in his hotel room, remembering the smell of soldering wires in his father's workshop. They were in different rooms, different cities, but both felt the same. Quiet gratitude. Damodardas Mulchand Modi. Words had lived on, not just in his son, but in someone else's son, thousands of miles away. And now, those words were alive in the dreams of children who had seen a man on a screen tell them that nothing was too far if you kept walking toward it. The story was never just about technology or politics. It was about two fathers, two sons, and the invisible bridge built by kindness. Months passed since the first mentorship session. The program grew faster than anyone expected. At first, it was a handful of schools. Now, it reached villages so remote that even the postal service visited only twice a month. Children who once walked miles just to find a library now had the chance to speak directly to the man leading one of the biggest companies in the world. But the real change was not in the numbers or statistics. It was in the small moments that no headline would ever print. Like the boy in a dusty classroom in Rajasthan, who used to believe his life would be limited to farming, but now wanted to study engineering. Or the girl in Assam, who once thought computers were only for the rich, but now stayed after school every day, learning to code with an old donated laptop. Narendra visited one of these schools quietly, without any media following him. The students didn't know he was coming. When he entered the classroom, they stood in surprise, and one small boy handed him a notebook. Inside, the boy had written, in shaky handwriting, I will be the Sundar Pichai of my village. Narendra smiled, holding the notebook as if it were made of gold. He knew that this was what his father would have wanted, not applause, not recognition, but proof that kindness had multiplied. Thousands of miles away, Sundar received a letter. It was from a young girl in Gujarat who had watched his session. She wrote about how she wanted to invent a device that could help her grandmother walk without pain. At the end of the letter, she had drawn a small picture, two hands passing a cup of tea to each other. Beneath it, she wrote, Your father gave you respect. Prime Minister's father gave him kindness. You gave both to me. When Sundar read that, he closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear his father's voice again, telling him that leadership was never about being first. It was about making sure no one was left last. As the program continued, Narendra and Sundar rarely spoke about it in public. They didn't need to. They knew the real measure of success was not in announcements, but in the lives quietly transformed. And yet, sometimes, in rare quiet moments, both men would think about that small meeting room, the elderly man's story, and the invisible bridge their fathers had built long before they had ever met. It was a bridge made not of stone or steel, but of shared values. And as long as those values were passed from one person to another, the bridge would never break. In the end, the story was not about a prime minister and a CEO. It was about two boys from ordinary homes, shaped by extraordinary fathers, who proved that the words spoken in a small tea shop or a tiny workshop could travel across decades, across oceans, and change the future for thousands.